Hello, Adab, Namaste. I'm Geeta Anand, and on behalf of DC South Asian Arts Council, I want to welcome you and our distinguished panelists for an important discussion on COVID-19 and rise of anti-Asian hate crimes. DC South Asian Arts Council is committed to addressing racism and prejudice through various channels: advocacy, activism, and art. Now, I want to introduce to you tonight's moderator, Niharika Chibber. She is a United States civil servant. She is a prize-winning published poet and short story writer. Niharika speaks several languages but writes in English and sometimes in Japanese or in Hindi. She holds a BA and MA in Japanese language and literature from Jawaharlal Nehru University in India. She also holds an MA in International Relations from Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies in Washington, D.C. Here's Niharika. Over to you.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Geeta ji. Good evening and good morning, everyone. Happy Pride. My name is Niharika Chibber, and I'd like to begin by thanking the DC South Asian Arts Council for once again holding space for a very important discussion in their mission to lift up voices to promote equity and social impact. The United States is currently dealing with racial reckoning. Our awareness of the historic and systemic mistreatment of marginalized and underrepresented communities is heightened. As this happens, we are also witnessing a surge in hateful speech and actions against the Asian American Pacific Islander community. This has been brought on by the ongoing coronavirus pandemic, as well as the last administration's anti-China and anti-immigrant rhetoric. As we hear about the majority of anti-AAPI hate incidents not being reported or qualified as hate crimes, how are we dealing now? How have we dealt with this racism before? And why is this different? Please join me in welcoming our multi-generational, multi-ethnic panelists who will discuss the escalation of hate directed toward people of Asian and Pacific Islander descent. And they'll also give some thought to finding solutions for national recovery and healing. I am delighted to introduce to you first, Paul Igasaki. Paul is a community activist, lawyer, and public servant who wants to further opportunities to pursue our nation's ideal of fairness and equality. He has recently finished his term as Chief Judge and Chair of the U.S. Labor Department's Administrative Review Board. He was previously Vice Chair and Acting Chair of the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. He has been in leadership roles at national federal agencies and has led local community civil rights programs. His legal work has focused on civil rights, employment, immigration policy, and poverty law. He has served the needs of Asian Pacific Americans with a particular focus on their legal and civil rights. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you.
Next, we have Ms. Hurunnessa Fariad. She's the head of interfaith outreach at the All Dulles Area Muslim Society, the Adam Center. She's also the director of outreach for the Multi-Faith Neighbors Network. She's a bridge builder who cultivates understanding between American Muslims and other faith groups and organizations. Through dialogue and community work, Hurunnessa connects with Americans from all backgrounds and cultures. Harnessing the power of grassroots work, community collaboration, and volunteer potential, she seeks to bring awareness to local and national issues, including diversity, women's leadership, racial equity, and multi-faith peace building. Welcome, Hurunnessa. Next, we have Linda Butcher. Linda is a good friend and is the executive director of the International Student Conferences. Prior to this, she was director of media relations and public affairs at the Korea Economic Institute of America, and she's also been a legislative researcher at the Embassy of the Republic of Korea. Linda has worked on several state and national campaigns and interned with the office of Senator John Kerry, where she focused on foreign policy and environmental issues, while also assisting the senator on a side project related to the increasing role of the Asian American community in the United States. She has written and spoken on topics related to technology, security, gender, and environmental issues. Welcome, Linda. Justin Chan is next. He is a dedicated community leader and is currently the Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Administrator at the Department of Health Services, Development Disabilities Administration, supporting over 4,500 employees and 45,000 clients. He previously served as the program coordinator at the Washington State Department of Early Learning and as legislative assistant to Seattle City Council member Sally Bagshaw. He has also served AAPI communities across Washington State as the interim director and executive assistant to the Washington State Commission on Asian Pacific American Affairs. Next, we have Samara Tahmid, who is a project manager advancing public health programs and health equity through engagement with community and government partnerships at the National Council for Mental Well-Being. She addresses how community changes due to racism and xenophobia and how they have affected resource allocation and needs for AAPI mental health. Previously, Samara was a program coordinator at the New York State Department of Mental Health and Hygiene. Do we have Ben D. Guzman here yet? And if not, I will go ahead and introduce Nacha. Oh, here's Ben. Hi, Ben. Nice to see you. So let me introduce Ben D. Guzman. Ben is the director of the Washington, D.C. Mayor's Office on Asian and Pacific Islander Affairs. For 2 decades, he has been a leading voice at the local and national level on issues of racial equity, immigrants' rights, veterans' affairs, and LGBTQ justice. He comes to the AAPI Affairs Office from the Mayor's Office of LGBTQ Affairs, where he served as the Community Outreach Specialist. He has also served as both the Public Information Officer and the Americans with Disabilities Act Compliance Officer for the agency. Welcome again, Ben.
Thank you for having me.
Sure. Last but not the least, by any means, Nacha Srinakarin is a lawyer, artist, social worker, and grant writer at the DC South Asian Arts Council. Nacha is passionate about working at the intersection of art and social justice and advocating for issues that impact the disenfranchised. She has over a decade of experience in public interest advocacy and international development. Previously, she worked for Human Rights First, where she conducted research to guide refugee programs in New York for the International Rescue Committee and matched asylum seekers with pro bono legal representation in the Washington, D.C. area. So welcome to our very passionate and committed panelists. As our audience can see, we are very diverse here, lighting up your screen. And as AAPIs, we're very diverse. Yet we have some common experiences based on who and what we are not. We are people of color, but we are not Black or of Latin heritage. We are also not white. So let me start by asking, show of hands, how many times have we been asked to go back to our country? Go back to your country, we're told, right? And 2, 3, 4 hands. And I think based on that, I would want to start out by saying, asking our panel here, we are from different parts of Asian heritage. We have different experiences. Some of us were born here. Some of us came here as babies and toddlers, and the rest of us came here to go to graduate school, like me. And I have been asked many, many, many times why I don't sound like those other Indians. Why don't you sound like Apu? why don't you sound like those other people? And so I want to know from each of you your little AAPI lived experience or anecdote that you would want to share that might have happened to you or a family member or a friend. So I'm just going to open this up and start with Paul.
Okay. Well, I've been fortunate that I haven't been assaulted or had immediate family members assaulted or that sort of thing. Although I'm 65 and have thousands of experiences of being told to go home, people doing this with their eyes, congratulating me on my English, not being clear where I was born, and not accepting Chicago as the answer. So, I mean, we've all been through that, and that sort of thing, I think, isn't necessarily such a terrible thing once you get used to it. And we can't educate everyone, but I just remember once my first trip to Japan as a tourist. I looked American. I was traveling with a white girlfriend at the time. I had a Cubs T-shirt on, and two white Americans came up to me and asked. I was in Miyajima. They said, "Where is Big Buddha?" And it was a Shinto shrine. So I explained to him there was a Shinto shrine, and he's thinking about another city. And he said, "Oh man, you got really good English." I said, "Thank you. Yours needs a little work." But I think the truth is that we experience those sorts of things all the time, and it's on the same gradation to more violent, more negative stuff. I hear about people of kids actually accosting each other, and of course, we've heard about the killings and the attacks. But it's all there. I mean, the racism is underneath all of it, and that's the challenge we face.
Thanks, Paul. And you're right, and that's why we wanted to have this panel be different age groups, and I wanted it to be multi-generational because we all come to this with a different experience and with our own lived experiences where we are talking about, it was forever thus. And some of us are rising up in the streets and others are rising up in social media and we can get to that and talk about that more. But Hurunnessa, do you have a story to share with us? I'm sure you do.
I have so many. But just to bring light into a topic that I want to also touch upon today is aggression minorities usually have done to them by other minorities. I came to the United States when I was 5 as a refugee from Afghanistan, and I landed at JFK Airport, and that's where I grew up. I grew up in Flushing, Queens, and if you know anything about Flushing, Queens, it's extremely diverse, mostly very populated by Asians, and that's what I grew up with, and that's home. Whenever I think about the word home, it's always Flushing. And 9/11 had happened, and I was coming on the 7 train back from college, and I was pregnant with my second daughter at that time. And this Asian woman looked at me and she started calling me Bin Laden. And at that point, I didn't realize what she was saying until I got off the train and I realized she was calling me Bin Laden. And she herself, as a minority, as an Asian, to put that type of hate on me was something I really had a hard time adjusting to, even till today, because I really remember that. She didn't speak English that well. She, might have just come here recently. And I realized her spewing that word the whole ride, I think she said it 50 times to me. And because I'm not a confrontational person, I didn't say anything back to her. Plus, I knew she didn't speak English. So what was the point? I think that's something we need to address also, is this concept that minorities are also, perpetuate the hate and a rhetoric that is unacceptable. And if I had told her that I myself am Asian and from the same area she's from, close to it, I don't think she would have understood that in the context of where I was coming from. But we really need to be careful about what it is we're saying.
Absolutely, and these are conversations that we have, I think, at home and with our kids and with our peers about how racism is not the prerogative of the white person. Right. We each come to our experience with our own unconscious bias, and we within, I think we don't even have to be different communities of Asian people within the same community. I think I probably have enough examples of fellow people in the Indian American community or in the Indian community who had told me that my skin was just so dark that nobody would ever marry me. So, you don't have to go outside of that. But yet, there are all these experiences of being out there and being out and about. So Justin, what about you?
Yeah, I think that for me, growing up in Seattle, it was really interesting. It's a pretty progressive place, and yet there's still some microaggressions here and there. That it's so interesting when people assume that I'm really great at certain skills, or that I'm the model minority, for example. That I'm great in mathematics, or that I'm the tech support, in my organization. Certainly, those have been just minor things. And, when I was growing up, my family had a trip to Montana, and on the way there, we got stopped by the police. And thankfully, I didn't experience, violence. My life was not taken from me. But, I was 6 years old at the time, and our family, we were told that they obviously knew we're not from around here. And we were told to go to a bank, withdraw cash, and give it straight to that officer, knowing that we probably wouldn't come back and file a complaint. And so that was pretty traumatizing for me. And I never knew why I always felt nervous. Like my hands were always shaking when I was around officers, until I went back and realized that was a really traumatic experience, because my dad was yelling at the officer. And it was 3:00 in the morning. It was a dark night, and who knows what would have happened if my skin color was different. So I bring that as an example of just things have happened. We've been called again. We don't belong here. We're not from here. I always have that sense of feelings around that. And of course, as Taiwanese American, I'm not truly Taiwanese. I'm not truly American. So feeling like I'm in between.
Thank you for that. And I think that is an important aspect to bring up, the whole idea of in-betweenness, and who we really are, and what is our identity. And we are as American and patriotic Americans as we are in touch with our heritage, and sometimes getting that across is really, really tough. Ben, what about you?
Well, it's funny. We talk about intersectionality and how different kinds of discrimination based on kind of immutable characteristics can have a multiplied effect. My story that I like to tell may be a little bit off the beaten path from it, but my twin brother and I were literally at a playground, talking about the playground stories, when we were like 4. And, this white kid came up to us and didn't know what to make of us, probably for a lot of reasons. And he went through the first sort of triumvirate of Asianness, right? He said, "Are you Chinese? No. Are you Japanese? No. Are you Korean? No. Are you Siamese?" And my twin brother and I looked at each other and we're like, "Are you serious?" And we said, "No." So, I actually don't remember how the story ended, but, I think that while I sort of poke fun of my identity as a twin American and wait for my parade for that part of my life, it does speak to the reality that sometimes the sum is different than the whole of its parts. And the stuff that I would go on to face later as a gay man and an Asian American, and the ways in which masculinity get caught up with race and that sort of thing, that's its own story. But but it all, I think, begins from those experiences that we have when we're very young.
Thank you for sharing that, Ben. And I think we have all, and I appreciate your bringing up your twin identities, because that is, especially in an Asian American context, that's a multiplier effect, overcomplicating factor. And so I'm sure there are many stories that you have, and not all funny stories, but I'm glad you brought it up. I'm glad we're putting it out here and holding space for this discussion in this way and lifting it up. As I was telling the panel behind the scenes, that I want this discussion to be some head, a bit of heart, and a lot of soul. So we're here for collective healing, to have a conversation that helps us go out into the world and be these forced ambassadors, who have to educate others. And we'll come to that when we talk about, my God, I'm tired. I don't want to have to keep teaching people. So, but, we're going to go and talk to Linda now and ask Linda for a story that will add to our patchwork quilt of stories here that we can take and then elevate to our broader discussion.
Definitely. So like the fellow panelists, I have a lot of stories. Some that come to mind do have to do with food related. I get asked a lot if I eat chicken feet, why does Korea eat cow intestines? A lot of questions such as that nature. But like Ben, I think that so much has happened in my childhood. So I was born and raised in Massachusetts. I'm a second generation Korean American, and my parents came from Korea for a better life for their children. And I remember in 5th grade, I never saw myself to be different from my peers. My small suburban town was predominantly Caucasian. And my 5th grade teacher, in her goal to express diversity and inclusiveness, had pieces of colored paper. And she was in the front of the room, and she had people raise their hand if their skin color was the color of the colored paper. Again, I was one of few minorities. And when she put up the yellow paper, I didn't raise my hand. And so she whispered to a student in the front, and that student yelled at me saying, "Linda, raise your hand, you're yellow." And so that was very shocking to me. And I just remember feeling like, oh my gosh, I'm like front and center. I don't like where I am. I feel very uncomfortable. And it got worse because during recess, I had a lot of my classmates chasing me, telling me different objects that are yellow, saying yellow is the color pea, is the color chicken. And I remember going home that day and just knowing why my parents came to this country. And I just felt terrible to even share with them what happened, because I didn't want to have them feel bad about what it is that happened. And now being grown up, I think about that story. I can't believe that what was supposed to be a good intention project by a teacher who you look up to and respect and always find to be correct, that happened in that classroom.
And again, as parents now, this is one of those things where we're hearing everybody's stories, and it's bringing us pause. And for some stories, we're like, well, of course that happened, because that's what has been happening forever. And then we arrive at stories of this like targeted trauma that are just, you can't even imagine being told that, yellow is the color of pea and that's who you are. And I want us to share these stories out loud so that we can educate all of those who are watching and will watch after, that even though we're called model minority and told that, we're going to be good at math, and I get on a plane and people, or if somebody, God forbid, is looking for a doctor, they look at me, I don't even play a doctor on TV. So I think understanding that going about our lives and going about our business, we are targets as well, is very, very important. And so that brings me now to Samara for any story that you would want to share.
Yeah, so I'm also, I guess, no stranger to microaggressions, and I know that Justin brought up the idea of betweenness. And for me, as a first-generation Bangladeshi American Muslim, a lot of times I feel like I'm struggling between my identities, where it's like I'm not Bengali enough, I'm not American enough, I'm not Muslim enough. And when we talked about otherness, one of the stories that really came to my mind was, again, from childhood. And a lot of my family members make fun of me because I can't speak Bengali properly. I have a very Americanized accent. But something that a lot of people don't know is that Bengali was my first language. And I went 3 to 4 years in school with ESL, and I was forced to speak English. My parents were told that they shouldn't teach me any more Bengali. And now, as an adult, I can understand the language completely. But when it comes to responding, I struggle. And sometimes I wonder if it's because of this internalized shame that has come from my childhood.
Thank you, Samara, for that. And I think this is how cultures and linguistic traditions are obliterated. And we've seen this in other cultures and other places too, where assimilation means that you have to get rid of who you are. Nacha, how
Yes,
about you?
absolutely. Many stories, but I'll pick the top story for now since it's personal. So in my most recent workplace, we were just having a conversation and somebody called me brown, and I said, sure, tan is a shade of brown, just jokingly trying to shut down the microaggression at a workplace. And I was like, yeah, tan is a shade of brown. And he says, yeah, everything that's not white is a shade of brown. And I said, wow, that's very interesting, because I was just making a joke, like, as in it's summertime, I'm really tan right now. So, just that's a personal microaggression that happened. But right now there's a lot of similarly related microaggressions that is happening. Like one of my friends in New York City was trying to just enter her apartment, and her neighbor's friend started yelling at her, "Ni hao," and she said, "I'm not Chinese, I'm Korean." And he said, "Oh, like, you don't have to shut down a joke. I was just trying to be funny." And that person lived next to her. So these stories are really just very commonplace right now. And that's why we need this kind of panel. And so 3 months after that happened to me, I co-chair the diversity committee at my recent workplace, because I thought that we really have a lot of work to do in various settings.
So, Paul had a story about being in Japan and, being mistaken for a Japanese person who doesn't speak English. And I have a little bit of a story of being in Japan, and I was trying to buy something. I was at a Shinto shrine, and I was trying to buy a snack. And I speak Japanese. I speak Japanese for a living. And the gentleman said to me, he crossed his hands and he said, "Mayo," which is no over in Chinese. Yeah. And he kept saying "mayo" to me. And I asked him in Japanese, I said, "Why are you saying that to me in Chinese?" And he said, "Well, there are a lot of Chinese people here." So the assumption was there are a lot of Chinese people here. You're a foreigner. You've shown up. It doesn't matter whether you're speaking Japanese to me. It's mayo to you, and you're not getting anything. So I don't think it's, only in the United States. It happens to us elsewhere too. But then that brings us to the bigger question of, what do we do about it? What are we doing now that we're at this time of reckoning, when these hate crimes have gone up? They're not being reported as such always. And we're told to, be quiet and sit down and not attract attention. What do we do? How do we start that? And I think I want to go to Ben on this, because his job is the director of AAPI affairs at the DC Mayor's office. So I want to know, what kind of outreach are you guys doing? And what work are you doing in terms of, coalition building or anything to get this to,
yeah. I would say there's two things. On one hand, I like to think of the distinction maybe by using a dated academic reference, but I always think about Robert Putnam's idea of bowling alone, and the idea of building social capital, building human capital, in terms of the work that we do to build community. Right. So on one hand, he makes a distinction between internal community building and external, like bridge building. So from our perspective, on one hand, we're providing education for the Asian and Pacific Islander community, right? We are, in a very specific way, we're providing them with information about COVID-19, relief and recovery efforts. But part of that for us is, teaching them, telling them about the incidents that are happening, right? So holding, panels about anti-Asian violence, being public about, the role that we play in providing support for our residents if they are, unfortunately, if they are the victim of an attack. At the same time, we are educating our residents, our colleagues in city government, our residents who are not Asian American about who we are. So last week, we just had another one of our dinner time talks that we started with the Mayor's Office on African American Affairs and the Mayor's Office of Religious Affairs, where we're, intentionally building bridges with other communities and talking about, violence and how it happens against different communities and, building solidarity through understanding of the different impacts that white supremacy and, hatred have on all of us.
Thank you, Ben. I think, what resonates here, you guys are doing great work. What resonates is the bridge building aspect, and all of us here on my screen, all these lovely people are all bridge builders in one way or another. Paul through his long-term public service, Nacha through her art and legal work, Samara because she works on mental health, Hurunnessa does interfaith bridge building, Linda does cross-continental US-Asia bridge building, and Justin is a community activist who is building bridges in his community. So as bridge builders and talking about, the toll that these microaggressions or just blatant aggressions take on mental health, and the fact that mental health is highly stigmatized in the Asian community writ large. Think about going to a parent and saying that you need to see somebody because you have anxiety issues or whatever. You're told to walk it off pretty much. So Samara, you work in this field. What kind of work are you all doing, or organizations such as yours doing to take care of the mental health of the AAPI community? And are you seeing an uptick in people who might be seeking that kind of help, or how's it going?
Yeah, so there's definitely been an uptick. I think just the fact that we're in a global pandemic alone, everybody is facing stress regardless of what race or ethnicity you are. But that being said, one of the studies that's recently been done with Asian Americans, they showed that Asian Americans who have faced racism actually find the racism and violence against them more stressful, and or even the idea of it happening, than the pandemic itself, which is alarming. And there are several strategies that mental health providers and advocacy organizations are putting in place to address this. I think the number one thing is that racism is being seen as a public health issue, and that's huge because I don't know if y'all remember, but back in February we had President Trump basically pass an executive order banning all federally granted programs, especially public health programs, from even mentioning the word race or health equity or equity. So the fact that we came out on the other side and it said straight out that racism is a public health issue is a really big thing. I think the other thing that we're focusing on is trauma-informed, resiliency-oriented care. I think all of us to some degree, because we come from other countries or maybe our families have, or we have friends, we've faced trauma somewhere along the way. It's touched our lives, especially generational trauma. And one of the things that we talk about in mental health a lot is trauma-informed care, which is new, but it shifts the conversation from, what's wrong with you to what's happened to you. And the resiliency-oriented portion of that asks communities, what's strong with you? And that's really important because the what happened to you part is addressing trauma, PTSD that's happened to folks. But the what's wrong with you part is teaching communities about resiliency and trying to prevent trauma. So that's also something that's major that's happening. And I know that there are several other strategies because one of the things that we were talking about, the day before was stigma. And there is different types of stigma, but and it's a huge barrier to everybody in every community. And one of the things I think a lot of psychologists and healthcare providers have realized is that sometimes, that one-on-one therapy, getting an individual to go to a psychiatrist is a very difficult first step. But there are a lot of innovations out there that are helping make that first step, whether it's group therapy or support group. I know that a lot of communities are making healing spaces, safe spaces for conversations, and those are just as important as going to a psychiatrist.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. I think there are a lot of people who are listening who will find that heartening and healing. I think I have learned that mental health is a public health issue now, and so talking about what's happened to you versus what's wrong with you, I want to take this to Hurunnessa, who is a practicing Muslim woman. She's a mom. She wears hijab. She was in, in New York during 9/11, and has really borne the brunt of a lot of accumulated hate, one after the other, since this onslaught that started on 9/11. Hurunnessa, how have you dealt with this? And you are a bridge builder. You are doing interfaith work. So what has your journey been from that onslaught, which I imagine is a continued onslaught, and you have daughters who are grown up, who don't wear hijab? I'd like you to address that as well. So, since 2001 and then since 2016, what has it been like?
Well, it's been definitely a roller coaster ride, and I don't even go on roller coasters. So, like I mentioned, growing up in New York City, it has its advantages in many different angles. But at the same time, when 9/11 happened, it literally turned my life upside down in many ways. I had the New York City anti-terrorist FBI task force come to my house because my neighbor across the street thought it was suspicious activity because we were bringing in boxes because we were moving. And they stopped us in our house 2 days before we left on the drive down to Florida. And they told us that, hey, if we had missed you, we would have, shut down the highway and found you and stopped you. And the images of that was just horrifying to be in that situation, because then that would include the media and then your name being out there, and then now you have to clear everything up. So there's always that panic of, oh my God, what's going to happen to me? I remember the day after 9/11, I was in my car, and like I said, I was pregnant, and a lady I was at a red light, and the lady next to me saw me, and she looked at me, and she started cursing really loud. And I had my windows up, but I was so scared that she was going to do something because I saw the anger in her face. I thought she was literally going to come out, and she was screaming and yelling. And she started, sticking her middle finger at me. I literally went inside the chair of my car. Like, maybe if I hide, she won't see me anymore. And I shouldn't have to go through that. Right. And I had my daughter was in the car and I was pregnant, and the whole trauma of it was just a bit too much, to the point where my teachers told me, and it was my last semester of college, don't come to school. Just do your homework at home. Don't come. And I was like, that's just messed up that I have to stay home and do my work from home because people are racist outside. Right. And automatically the first thing people think about me when they see me without knowing me is I don't speak English, that I'm an oppressed woman, that I wear hijab because my husband forces me, and that I have no self-worth and I don't have an opinion, which is completely false. I mean, I'm an Afghan from New York City, so
they need to spend 5 minutes with you.
If you sit with me 5 minutes, you will definitely know that that's not the case. So as I started doing my work, and I really am passionate about my multi-faith work, because I feel, for many reasons. Number one, people need to get to know us, regardless of what it is you're advocating for and what information you're giving. You have to let people know who you are. You need to be vulnerable. You need to let people know how you're feeling and what they're saying and doing and how that's affecting you in your daily life. You have to point that out, because people think it's no big deal, I'm just calling you a name. Like, no, it is a big deal, and I'm going to stop you. This is why. And having that conversation in a civilized way where you're educating that person so that they get a sense of what it is you're going through is really important. So in my line of work, I've realized that there's blockades even as being a woman in the work that I do. So in order to, advocate for myself, when men don't give me space, I make space for myself. So in my multi-faith work, I started my own podcast. I have two co-hosts, a female rabbi and a Black female Christian scholar, Dr. Sabrina Dent and Rabbi Susan Sheckman. And we talk about life, faith, resiliency based around our faith as American women of faith. Although our faiths are so different and the viewpoints are so different, we come together because we're human. And we want to give that portrayal out to other people, that women do have a voice. We're from different backgrounds, we're from different faiths, but we are together as human beings. And I also started the first mosque youth choir in the country. I have a music background from New York City, and these kids do multi-faith, interfaith work where they're meeting other kids from other faith backgrounds and getting to know one another. So all these different ways of talents that we have to utilize them. They're ways to really bring in children and letting them know that they have to love and respect not just themselves, but other people as well. But we have to be creative. Dialogue does not work with kids. We have to bring in these ideas that really resonate with them, these fun activities that we can do with them so that they're pulled in. We talked about my four daughters. My eldest is 21. She's starting her last year in college, and my youngest is about to turn 13. I'm a single mom, and they see me, on the news. They see me doing different things. I'm, in the forefront of the, second largest mosque in the United States as head of outreach. Sometimes for them, it's definitely something to be proud of. And I hear that from them, that even though like my situation is the way it is, it doesn't mean that it has to stop me. That even as an American Muslim woman of Asian background, most people think I'm Arab and they start speaking to me in Arabic and I'm like, I don't even know what you're saying. Like, okay, like English, that would be great. Of course, that's a perception, right? So my daughters will tell people like, oh, do you know my mom? And they're like, oh, who's your mom? Whatever. And then she's like, oh, you don't know her? Okay, just Google her. Like for them, it's a form of being proud of the fact that we women can get to that point where even during our circumstances that might not be ideal, we can perpetuate a positive thing in the outcome of life and moving that forward. So we need to be open to these things. We need to be able to have these dialogues with other people and not pass judgment based on what we see, but rather really get to know people and allow that door to open up and say that even the Asian community is so diverse, right? What does that mean? We have to be able to have these discussions and these conversations. And the other last thing I want to say is advocating for people who are not from your background. With the work that I do, I don't advocate just for Muslims and women. I advocate for Asian Americans. I advocate for people who are Hindu, who are Sikh, who are even atheists. I don't care what your background is. I don't care what your faith is. You're a human being. You deserve that respect. And I wouldn't be following my faith if I was just advocating for myself.
Thank you so much. This is that I'm not crying, you're crying moment. But I'm gonna move this to take it to Nacha now, because we're talking about advocacy. Hurunnessa, thank you so much. And I think you're gonna be mobbed at the end of this. If we were in person, you'd be, everyone would be lining up for your autograph right about now. But Nacha, Hurunnessa talked about advocacy, and you are at the intersection of your work in law and your work as an artist. So what are the kinds of inclusion and equity and diversity activities, efforts that you're seeing in your workplace, in the areas that you work in? And what can other organizations be doing? We already have Hurunnessa doing yeoman's work in her field. We have Ben's office doing all this outreach. We have Justin out in the field, and Linda educating the next generation, and Paul doing all this grassroots community work. So what do you think that, I feel like we're in an echo chamber here, but we want to break out of the echo chamber and get across to everyone who's listening and who might have unconscious biases one way or another. And they're seeing, looking at the screen and saying, oh, it's a bunch of Chinese and Indians, and not really figuring out who we are and what we do. So what do you think is important that organizations be doing?
So in my background as a social worker, I'm a less traditional lawyer because previous to my legal training, I worked with refugees, I worked with marginalized populations and at-risk youth with behavioral health needs. I worked out of Brooklyn in low-income communities, and I moved to DC later to continue that work. So I think one of the most important things to sustain an effective advocacy campaign is truly grassroots movement. So we see the group AAPI Hate was a consortium of 3 AAPI organizations that started a website, and they started collecting data. So I'm answering your question in reverse order, actually, because I think that's
it's totally
just,
fine.
it will help you. Yeah. So AAPI Hate started tracking and documenting and creating analytics and data around the hate crimes being unreported. So it's truly a grassroots movement because they were collecting voices that would not be heard by the legislator. These voices would not otherwise be heard by people in positions of privilege and positions of power that were creating legislation that ultimately impacts everyone. So when we build coalition as organizations, as advocacy groups, it's truly important because we're looping in people that otherwise would be marginalized. And that is in something that I learned from being a social worker and working with groups that otherwise would not have their voices heard. And I think truly when AAPI Hate became a robust group, California in February of this year enacted legislation which started funding them, and now they're in receipt of $1.4 million to the Stop AAPI Hate campaign. So now they can even build a larger coalition. So I truly respect that, and that's why I think that this conversation, like many conversations you can see, the founders of Stop AAPI Hate are also hosting a panel. I think it's sometime this week. So tune into that as well. And so to broaden our conversation. So it's really these minor acts of coming together, coalition building, and saying, hey, it doesn't matter what group, what subcategory of Asian you are. It doesn't even matter what subcategory of minority or marginalized population you are. Like we have discussed, there's so many intersections at this juncture, right? So there are Asian communities in low income areas. There are Asian communities that are celebrating Pride Month. There's Asian communities that are really struggling with disability, as Samara had said, mental health issues. At these intersections is where we truly have a stake in creating a stronger voice, because we're pulling and broadening the notion that this is really a civil rights movement. We are all equal. It doesn't matter how we're different. And it doesn't matter if our difference is something that we can see or not. With this hate crime, the rise in hate crime, it is something that we can see. And I think that's what really calls for this change in legislation. But the change in legislation would not otherwise happen if we were to come together and raise awareness. How would our legislators know that there's an issue? Like we can't rely on mainstream media that's polarized. We have to rely on ourselves, our expertise. And it just really speaks to the work that we're doing. And to answer the next question, in my previous organization, and Samara can speak more on this, at the National Council of Mental Wellbeing, I co-chair the first Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion group that we really propose for changes in a strategic plan to include diversity in various conversations. One of the things that I advocated for, because I thought it was extremely important with my background as a mental health practitioner and a social worker, was forming affinity groups in the workplace. Affinity groups truly help communities of color be able to collect and gather their voice of feeling oppressed, feeling marginalized. I see Justin nodding. Please feel free to add on to this because this is your work. And this DEI effort is truly grassroots, even internally within the organization. So in the increase of hate crimes for Asian Americans in the workplace, affinity groups can truly give staff a safe space to voice their thoughts, voice their concerns. They don't want to go to their supervisor directly. They don't want to go to HR directly. They want to talk amongst themselves first to feel validated. And I think conversations like this empower minorities. And that empowerment is that spark that ignites change. That's why I think the storytelling, creating panels and conversations, it's so powerful, because we all come out feeling empowered. Yeah, we all come out feeling like there are things that we can do even as an individual. And that reflects in art. For example, Etsy, huge company, you may know of them. So for Asian American History Month, they were focusing the spotlight on their front page on Asian American artists that are supporting local artists itself. So it's like a chain reaction. So some artists were going to restaurants saying, hey, can I paint and draw your restaurant for this graphics that I'm making? And restaurants are like, absolutely, thank you for promoting our business. And that's really grassroots coalition building. And that can be started internally by DEI efforts in the workplace as well. And that it truly is one of the most robust ways to reduce microaggression, because instead of just telling leadership, you're working in solidarity and creating conversations. So it's really more positive. You're not reprimanding and punishing somebody for being aggressive. You're really saying, hey, maybe that's coming from a place of ignorance. Maybe we should talk about it. And to conclude, that's where art and culture come in. That's why I do the work that I do, because I think art really speaks to people that otherwise don't have the tools to speak. And you see, when right now there's refugees creating art therapy is a way to cope with mental health, and just promoting these conversations through culture, through education, and through events like this can really shape the conversation that empowers people, and that ultimately creates a momentum that changes legislation.
So
thank you so much. And I'm going to throw the mic right to Justin now to pick up from there.
Yeah, so Nacha, 100% agree with you. And I'm sending you so much love and vibes. I think that there needs to be healing before we can take action, right? We need to come together for some collective healing as a community. And a lot of our white allies, some of our white leaders here in the community are, saying, well, why are there separate spaces for BIPOC communities? Why are separate spaces for Asian American and Pacific Island communities? And the reason why is because we need to have our own process, our own collective space to heal and talk, without the feeling of being over traumatized again, without having some of those understand or some of those perspectives that just people will not understand if they're not from the AAPI community. And so I wholeheartedly agree with you on that.
Thank you for that, Justin. And I think, recently, I don't know who's watched the show Kim's Convenience on Canadian Broadcasting. It's on Netflix. And I recently read something in the paper about how the show's been canceled, but there was this whole conversation on how the showrunners never had an AAPI person, let alone a Korean person, writing or being involved at the back end of the show. And only the actors and all of these stereotypical images that they were creating for the actors, and the actors had to really fight back and say, no, so that's why representation matters. And that's why we need our own space. It's not to be exclusive. It's to just take a moment and take a pause. And so I'm going to, Paul is going in and out, so I'll catch him whenever he's back in. But I want to now take this to Linda, because as we're talking about healing and space, Linda, you are the executive director of a nonprofit organization that does student exchange. So you are working with East Asian students, American students, at a time when nobody was welcome in this country for a while from abroad. And then we have COVID, and then we have all of this, a rise of AAPI hate. But on top of that, you're a mom raising two little boys who may or may not present as Asian. And how has it been for you as a mother and then as in your workspace dealing with this?
So I'm fortunate that I feel that what I do at work really does echo also what I do raising our two children with my husband. And that is really planting the seeds in the next generation of people, because I really do feel, as we discussed at the beginning, that so much conversation, education needs to happen early on. Our first conference, Japan-America Student Conference, is the first and continuing exchange between US and Japan. And it was created and started by college students who were concerned about a pending war and thought to themselves, how can we serve as a bridge when our governments won't see eye to eye? How can we still have a strong relationship to people? And that was the start of people-to-people diplomacy between US and Japan. And they started that first conference to come together to build mutual understanding of the two countries, to be able to get to know one another. And then that happened to them at an impressionable age when they're college students. And that helped them as they continue their career, because when they're in their career and they may be hearing, oh, Americans are this way, the stereotypes, like they're not going to negotiate with you, they're not going to work with you, and the stereotypes of people of Japan. But these JASCers, the Japan-America Student Conference alumni, they would sometimes see across the negotiating table their friend from a conference that they did as a student when they had academic freedom. So that's a big part of what we do from the start of our conference in 1934. And we began the China-America Student Conference after many years of research, of meeting with individuals, entities, organizations, to find out what should be our third conference after Japan and Korea. And China was one that kept getting highlighted. So that was announced in December 2019. And then COVID happened. So we had a lot of conversations with our China America Student Conference executive committee members and also our delegates. And what we were finding was that so many of these Chinese students who were sitting in America, who served as our delegates, were not only isolated and quarantined in their dorm rooms, but they also could not really interact with their classmates because they felt very alone, that they couldn't have these real meaningful conversations because people were upset that they brought this virus to America. They saw all the headlines coming out of Washington, D.C. So I felt for the Chinese students who were studying in America, but through the China America Student Conference, they felt that they finally had a safe space where they could have conversations, come to mutual understanding, and really grow. And that's really what I love to see coming out of our student conferences, people coming in with a certain idea and really leaving with so much more education because they have that people-to-people bonding, that time to actually build lifelong friendships, to be real, vulnerable, and candid. So that was something that I faced in my tenure at international student conferences. Before the anti-Asian hate crimes were happening in America, a big question that I was receiving from across the Pacific was, is it safe to travel in America? We're hearing that every single American is carrying guns. We don't know if we're going to actually be safe when we visit the different parts of America on our conference. Like, how can you assure us that the students will be safe? So it's always an ongoing conversation. And definitely the conversation amongst the students have changed, that they are focusing a lot more on identity, inclusiveness, trying to get to the foundational understanding, and really spending more understanding about how do foreigners feel in different countries. So I see that kind of going with my children as well, educating them on what's going on. And a question I had early on with this past year and a half is, should I begin speaking about this with my 4-year-old son? He'll be 5 in September. And I was speaking to a friend who was an activist and telling her, should I really be discussing this with him and just letting him know what's going on? Because we are getting yelled at in the parking lot of the grocery store. He's seeing people giving me a double take and kind of following us around the grocery store. And she told me that it's a luxury if you're able to make the decision of when you can discuss with your child about hate crimes, because there are children across the globe who don't have that luxury. Parents who have to tell their very young child, this is why we were attacked, this is why you got yelled at. So that's been something we've been discussing with him, and also not only discussing it, but also serving as, trying to serve as a role model for him as to how to react in those situations, to understand where the person is coming from, why are they coming from it. And I was really heartened by him because one of our conversations when we talked about hate was, he told me, I believe in love because I've seen love and I continue to see love. And he always asked questions after the January 6th Capitol riots. He asked me, you know, are they bad guys? How will they become good? I want to see them become good. And that just really gives me so much hope for the next generation, working with our students on our conferences and also speaking to my very intelligent and wise 4-year-old son. So looking forward to continuing to plant a seed. But again, I feel like education, having that conversation with people who want to listen and learn is such a huge step.
Thank you for that, Linda. I have an anecdote about what my 13-year-old stopped us in our tracks yesterday when I was having a conversation with my husband, who's half Korean, about, you know, in preparation for this panel and what we're experiencing and how we should bring about it. And our son came up and said, well, what are you talking about? I said, we're talking about as people of color, you know, are we tired about talking about race? Are we tired? And he said, you and I are people of color. Dad isn't really, because as it turns out, Dad is not presenting as brown as we are. And he said, in fact, Dad probably has privilege because he presents as a white heterosexual male, and he's at the top of the pyramid. Now, my husband does not view himself that way because of the way he has received microaggression and things like that. But his kid, who is now perceiving him in a way, and he said, you are not going to experience homophobia. You are not going to experience pay issues the way mom would, because mom is going to come up against a glass ceiling, and mom, and I just stopped in my tracks because this is my middle schooler. And I was like, where did you learn this? And he said, what do you mean, where did you learn this? I read, I live in this world. So we're talking about that, and Paul disappeared. I was going to go to him to ask a question, but when he's back, I will. But in the meantime, you know, I want to go back to Ben because we're having a very robust conversation in the chat, but maybe I'll come back. Ben, I'll put you on hold. Paul is back for a minute. Paul, I'm going to catch you while I have you here because you're a slippery character right now. So we're talking about, you know, Linda talked about her woke 4-year-old, and I brought up my 13-year-old. And, you know, and you brought this up earlier too in the beginning about how anti-Asian sentiments are not new in this country. And this notion of perpetual foreigner remains and is nothing new. And so do you think that what we're experiencing right now is different from what you might have grown up with and what you might have dealt with in your professional and personal experience and your work at the Department of Justice on hate crimes? What is different about this time? What is the big deal about now?
Well, you know, frankly, I think the racism problem is the same. I mean, you go back to when our ancestors were new, there was mass lynchings of Chinese, of South Asians. People were driven out of towns during World War II. Before my families were sent to concentration camps, people vandalized their homes, took shots at them. So at a certain level, this stuff goes back throughout history. I remember when Martin Luther King came to march in Chicago, everyone supported him when he was in the South. But he got to Chicago and the white folks were just livid. And I asked my dad about it, and he said, well, if he really succeeds, then when you grow up, there won't be racism. Well, it's idealistic, and I would never say that to my daughter, who wouldn't allow me to these days anyway. But racism will be with us. I think what happens is that at a certain level, someone scapegoats, someone in power or with the public microphone, whether it's a politician or an actor or whoever, and says something racist and scapegoats us, or anybody else for that matter, then people at other levels act it out. some with violence, some with just epithets in a parking lot or scowls in schools. So, I mean, at that level, none of this is new. What I think is a bit new, a couple of things. One is we have a president of the United States who's doing it worse than anybody. And then we also had a pandemic, which had people closeted, the mental health pressures that we all felt, and the economic pressures uh, took place too. And I think that when you look at hate crimes, I mean, there's different kinds of hate crimes. There's the legal issue of hate crimes, and then the issue of aggressions and crimes that have some racial component. So many of the crimes that we hear of, people are being targeted because they're Asian, maybe, because they're elderly, maybe, and it kind of mixes together. And then there are hate crimes like the killings in Atlanta, where gender and misogyny combined with racism. And so what's new now is one, it seems to be more and more people are violent, more and more people are armed. I think what on the positive side is at least now we have Department of Justice. I wasn't at Department of Justice. I was at JACL lobbying Department of Justice on hate crimes issues. So, but if we look at Department of Justice now, they're more or less on our side. The Attorney General went to high school with me, and he was pretty progressive back then too. So I think that doing that sort of actions that we're trying to do at the community level and at a governmental level, I think that's happening, and that's good. I think the two things I would say for Asians and our organizations need to do. One is help people be safe, because there are people who are really scared of going out in the streets. What can they do? How can they protect themselves? I mean, most of us are probably not the ones saying go out there and arm yourself, but that's one thing. Seek support from government and make it easier for people to complain about hate crimes. And that's what the hate crimes amendments are about. But that's only a reporting issue. And the other side of the reporting issue is Asian Americans don't cite complaints. I was at EEOC for a couple of terms, and it's amazing how few Asians will tell me about horrific employment experiences. And I asked, well, did you file a claim? So, no, we didn't do that. And it's because we're afraid of doing it. We're afraid of troubling government. We're afraid of repercussions. So one of the things I used to say to Asian communities when I traveled around the country was, complaining is the American way. And the way you fix things, the way you support our system as patriots, is to say, this has happened to me and I don't want it to happen again. And so I think those are things that we can do. I think the thing that's kind of wearing for all of us is, with all that history behind us, with all of what we've seen. Yeah, I had this feeling back when I was in Chicago and working to organize people against the prosecution issues in the Vincent Chin case. But that was like decades ago now. And so this is going to be here through all of our lives and beyond. Hopefully it declines for Asian Americans, but as soon as the crosshairs are moved off us, it'll be on somebody else. And that's when we have to take action to support them as well. So, yeah, I think in some ways it's not at all new. I think the difference now is our community is more organized. Our community is larger. We're tipping elections in places in the South and the North. That didn't happen when I was younger. So we have the ability to demand, not just for ourselves, but for other communities as well. I think that is really what's been changed. And hopefully we can start to get the electorate and politicians to say no to people like Trump and people like him across the country.
Thank you, Paul. You may drop the mic now. I think the show is over. But that what you said is so important, and that's why it was so important to have your perspective as well, because we are, as a panel now, we have become best friends in the last hour, and we have our own little chat going and questions amongst ourselves. And so, what you were saying about reporting and not even stepping up and saying this happened because you're just supposed to be quiet. And that's a certain generation that did that. And, Ben mentioned that immigrant parents may not even have the ability to understand how their children are experiencing this. And so, Ben, what does one do? Where do you begin? Where does the understanding? Because at home, if you're struggling, if you're going out and having to deal with this, and you can't talk about it at home. And Linda was afraid to tell her parents because somehow it would let her parents down because they had come to this country to make a better life. And then the kid is not having a good time. And how do you tell your parents? What do you do? Is that something that your office, might consider handling in some way?
Well, now you're telling all the secrets from our private chat. So, no, I mean, well, to expand on our private chat, I compared the experience that immigrant parents have with their children, where, my parents, I felt like I couldn't complain to my parents about racism because they didn't understand how I was experiencing it, or I felt like they didn't, right? I mean, they were experiencing their own, racism, as adults and what have you. But, it's different on the playground, as they say, compared to Black folks who have the talk with their children, right? And that's kind of part of the narrative of, raising children for many folks. I compare that actually also to queer folks who, whose parents literally don't grow up many times with the experience they have. So for me, I couldn't even tell my twin brother about the things I was experiencing, when I began to feel a different kind of way about certain boys in my class. But I think, again, I do think education is part of the solution. I think, as a government response, at the risk of poking at another secret part of our private chat, as we talk about the Atlanta hate crimes, right? I think that that case is teaching us all about the limits of hate crimes and hate crimes prosecutions, right? I mean, Paul, we've been working on, the legacy of the Vincent Chin case for, many years, let's just say, without doing the math. But, it was always hate crimes, legislation and hate crimes enforcement. And that was, we can't hate crimes our way out of this, right? And so I think that, whether it's, education, whether it's, the dealing with the boogeyman of critical race theory, but knowing actually that ethnic studies saves lives. If you think about the scholars like Alison Tintiaco-Kubales, who talks very forthrightly about how ethnic studies saved her life when we were together at Berkeley, as I drop a name. But no, but and I think that our residents have called for more relevant curriculum here in the district. And for me, that is Asian American studies, that is ethnic studies. And it's also another government response is the evolving dialogue now about equity, and the ways in which equity is being, worked on, people have talked about it here in the corporate arena and in the academic arena, but, we have our emerging office of, our diversity, our equity officer here in the district. And so the city council is moving to final passage of equity legislation, which will require training for city employees. What is our role as an Asian American community in that broader multiracial dialogue? So, we have to show up in these dialogues as they're emerging. And also we have to make sure that, that they know that Asian Americans were part of the birth of ethnic studies in places like San Francisco State and Berkeley and, and moving forward from there. So, to me, those are just two of the governmental responses that we've seen, at least here in the district.
Thank you so much, Ben. And speaking of governmental responses, I have to invoke Executive Order 13985. It's tattooed on my brain as the president's first executive order that he signed on his first day in office, which is the diversity DEIA executive order that says that every branch of federal government in all its work will view it through a diversity, equity, and inclusion lens. So as a federal employee, I find myself now in several meetings a month talking about how our work will be more inclusive, will be more diverse, and not just in the hiring of staff, but even in the vendors that we work with. So are we reaching out to minority-owned businesses? Are we, how diverse are our panels? Who is showing up at our meetings? What are our commissions and boards looking like? So all of a sudden, we find those of us who are BIPOC have become very sought after to be on panels. And so that's a little funny little anecdote about that, but it's very heartening to see what's going on at the federal level. And, I know we're waiting for audience questions, but we have a lot that we're talking about here. And I want to start, we have about 10 minutes. I think our audience is mesmerized by our discussion. And as the questions come in, I'll be sure to ask them. But I want to start talking about, winding us down, talking about what allyship looks like. We've talked a lot about the issues. We've talked about coalition building. We've talked about government responses. We've talked about what we as individuals are doing. But when we have well-meaning friends, right, who reach out to us and want to comfort us and ask us how we're doing. And you get 10,000 texts after every hate incident asking you how you're doing, and you don't know how to respond to that because on that particular day, you might be just tired of the questions, or you might have to deal with your kid who's asking questions, or you might have lost somebody and you don't know what to do about it. But yet these are well-meaning people who might be taking to social media, or who worry that they might say the wrong thing, or they might not come across as intended. So how much of it is our job in that? I find myself in those situations comforting the comforter and saying, no, it's okay, you're fine, your question was okay. But what do we do to include our allies? And no, it doesn't matter who the allies are. They could be allies of the core community, of the BLM supporters or AAPI supporters. What do we do to bring allies in? Justin, you want to take that first?
Yeah, so from my perspective in state government, implementing this work in the field with our staff, with our families, our customers, our clients, it's really a journey. It really takes some introspection for each of our leadership to really understand that it's more than just training. It's about culture. It's about changing how we think about what is, in terms of the bottom line of our goal, that it's really about improving outcomes for our communities. And it's really also moving from this understanding of allyship to being a accomplice, right? Really understanding what is putting yourself sort of on the front lines, and also knowing sort of where you can be in terms of being able to do that. So some people might not be able to put their bodies on the front lines. They have certain disabilities, So really understanding how you can be in those spaces and be vulnerable and taking a stance. So we really want to make sure within our work that people are comfortable making mistakes, being comfortable, being uncomfortable, providing grace for themselves to make those faux pas, and really learning from them, right? So how do we then put ourselves sort of at risk in the most safe way, whether it is, putting your, sometimes your job or your body on the line, just like some of our BIPOC, individuals out there who often have to do that. So how do we spread awareness? How do we report hate crimes? How do we donate to those nonprofits? How do we speak up? How do we check in? How do we educate, ourselves as well as others in a way where we aren't fatigued, right? And how do we support ourselves? And part of our work in the state has really been to start with what people have talked about here as a panel, to really listen and think about commitment and accountability. So I mentioned about, training not being enough. So, where the rubber meets the road is funding, right? So really ensuring that your leadership is putting the money into this work, putting money into having a team developed, and really thinking about how that will then create results and accountability, right? So sitting down with community leaders, sitting down with tribes, lawmakers, agencies, stakeholders, power brokers, underrepresented communities, to build those courageous and safe spaces to create a shared vision. So having really a start to, how we can think about, where we truly agree on in terms of our shared traditions, values, and cultures, and lived experiences, and even talking about that trauma. And we have to have those safe spaces. And I think that for a lot of what's done here in Seattle, for example, KUOW had town hall meetings where people came together and talked about, what it means to be from the Islamic faith, or what does it mean to be a gun owner. Having those spaces where we can talk about that, to build compassionate spaces, is a start where we can normalize the conversation, where then we can organize tools and resources around it, and then we can operationalize the work, where we can implement it, have data-driven practices, have that continuous quality improvement in our systems as we think about DEI work. And I could talk for hours about it. I know we don't have too much time. That's sort of a snippet of what I'm doing.
That's why we have your email address. So thank you for that. I was really struck by the idea of being at risk in a safe way. And I want to now share the mic with Samara, who is our mental health expert, to just, take up this idea of allyship and, thinking about people that you serve and how they could benefit from being at risk in a safe way, and, what that might mean. Is that feasible? Is that something we aspire to? And I totally agree with Justin. It's something that I feel like I can do, but can everybody do that? Are we there yet? What about your constituents?
Yeah, so Justin brought up two great terms. One was culture. And I know a lot of times, as Asian Americans, we talk about cultural competency. But I think something that we should really start talking about is cultural humility, right? Because I think for a lot of people, cultural competency is almost like a checkbox. Like, yeah, I provided this in X amount of languages for Asian communities. But cultural humility is that lifelong learning. I think us as Asian Americans, we have a lot of cultural humility to do with other minorities as well, especially, our Black and African American communities out there, our Hispanic and Latinx communities. We need to be showing up for people the same way that they show up for us. And the other word that he used was allyship. And when I was posed this question, part of me got pissed off, because I'm like, when are we going to stop talking about allyship? And when are we going to start talking about, that accomplice piece, that co-conspirator piece? And the reason why, when you use the word co-conspirator, people associate that with negativity and criminalization. And the reason why is because people who invest themselves in DEI work are criminalized for dismantling the structural systems of racism that we're facing in our community. And that is putting yourself at risk, but it's a risk that we're gonna have to be willing to take in order to progress way beyond, this conversation. And it's gonna take time. And, one of the ways that you all, as, lovers of art, artists, people from media can help is to talk about bias, especially implicit bias, which is, so dangerous as it's unconscious. And how does that, how can we shift these biases over time to dismantle racism, to show minority communities in positive life to talk more about intersectionality, especially for folks that are in the mental health field. You know, a lot of times we're so traumatized that we don't even want to look at the news, you know, because you're re-traumatizing yourself when you're looking at the news of all these violence, hate crimes, and it's okay to step away sometimes, but we have to essentially give visibility to those that are invisible. And that's one of the ways that we can help individuals that face mental health and substance use problems.
Thank you so much, Samara. You know, I think one thing that I've been learning in my federal DEI training is that the idea of subject matter and definitions changes depending on context and where you are. So that's another important thing that we can learn, that we can stop to think about, that, you know, using one word in this context may not mean the same thing in another context. In my work, I work on US-Japan relations, and Linda is familiar with this. We have a heck of a time explaining Black Lives Matter to our Japanese siblings. We just can't get that through, because is it Black lives also matter? Or do only Black lives matter? Or do others not matter? Do all lives matter? It becomes a whole other thing, and we don't have the language yet. So language is evolving. You know, concepts are developing, and it's very important. You know, some people find it, again, fatiguing to stay abreast of all of that. But I think having these resources available is very, very important. Hurunnessa, what do you think?
Okay, so as an immigrant who came here as a very small child, one of the things I learned in the United States, it's that it gives you the opportunity that you don't get in a lot of the other country, and that's going through the channel of electing officials who will advocate for you. And this is something that I feel like we need to really get on with everybody in promoting people and putting people in office who can dismantle the racism, can change legislation that is hurting our communities. You know, we know that there's systemic racism in this country and is built in. So how do we get rid of that? Because that affects all of us. It's not just the Black community that's feeling it. Yes, they are the biggest group, but we are responsible for them, right? We have to advocate for them, because that is what it is we are supposed to do as human beings. So getting people elected in offices that are diverse, they're from different backgrounds, women, men, people from different, you know, walks of life. We need to bring these people into office, and then we would tell our allies, okay, you need to help us get the racists out of office, because they are hurting this country, and we've seen it time and time again. Things are not moving as fast as they should, because people are in office that do not need to be in there. Their time is done. We're not in that space anymore. We are not in that time anymore. If it wasn't for the fact that America is known worldwide as a safe haven for people to come and be in a safe space to grow, to give their children a education, to give a better life for their family, no one would come here. My family would not have come here. You know, we came as refugees from a war, but look, I'm here, I'm alive. And as a single mom, I'm raising my kids and I'm advocating for things, or at least I'm trying to, right? This would not happen anywhere else. If I had done this in Afghanistan, where I was born, I'd probably be dead tomorrow, right? Because the circumstances are different and society is different. But we have to take advantage of what we have in this country, is to promote these ideas of liberty and justice and equity for everyone through legislation, because we know if that's not going to change, we can have conversation with people left and right, but at the back end, it's going to come and slap us back in the face.
Well, we're being told we have 2 minutes to go, but I think I'm going to ask for 5, because this is a very interesting conversation, and we have a couple more questions to get to. And our audience is, you know, complimenting us in a great session. And there are 2 questions that are related that have come up. One is, how do you confront microaggression or aggression, you know, if it happens to you in the street or wherever? Like, what do you do? What are you supposed to do? And then related to that is another question that says, microaggression, there's concern that microaggressions have evolved into macroaggressions. And at the ground level, how do you reverse this trend without being perceived as aggressive? and having the tables turned on you, essentially. And, there are resources, there are bystander training programs and hollaback and whatnot. And so maybe Justin and Ben, you want to address those and tell us a little bit more on how one should deal.
Do you want to go first, Justin?
Oh no, I've been talking too much. I would say go for it, Ben.
Well, I guess I wanted to start by saying that I would be remiss in not crediting microaggressions research to the Asian Americans who really helped establish the field, whether it was Del Tzu back in the day or some of his proteges like Kevin Nadal, who have particularly worked on the intersection of microaggressions based on sexuality and race. So that being said, the one training that we've been talking about in the chat is the training that Hollaback does with Asian Americans Advancing Justice, AAJC. In full transparency, I am an alum of AAJC, and so, but they've done trainings with my office. I've seen their trainings, I've done them. They're doing them now. They've been in a high demand, because they're offering them for free. So you should check the websites, advancingjustice-aajc.org or hollaback.org, HOLLABACK.org. But yeah, so that's just one resource.
And I just really want to honor what Hurunnessa said in terms of really connecting with people. And certainly that there are times where you just feel like you might come off as aggressive. And I mean, what does that even mean, right? When you think about that, right? And I think that having conversations, it certainly can feel like people might perceive you as aggressive, but to be silent is being complicit. And being complicit means death for some people. We have to take a stance. And I would say if you want to approach it in a way where we can meet people where they're at, it's having those conversations, really understanding their values, asking the right questions, listening, and really building those bridges where you can maybe start to see that each of us, even though we look very different from different communities, we have all the same values. And we want this country to do well. We want every community to do well. It's not a zero-sum game. If one community does better, we all do better. And so I want to really honor what you said, Hurunnessa. I think it's really important for us to move that forward. Thank you.
And just adding to what Justin said, there's plenty of ways to disarm microaggressions without being rude. I know for myself, one experience was I had a coworker who literally was sniffing around my cubicle and was like, smells like Indian food. And she looked directly at me and I'm like, first of all, I'm not Indian, but I think a lot of people do enjoy Indian food. So it can be anybody in this office space.
Yeah. I wanted to add to that. I had this lady come from West Virginia to Adams Center because she wanted to see a mosque for the first time. And, she was a Christian lady and she was very adamant about making sure I knew that she was Christian. So I said, yeah, sure, come, let's go. And she came and she's like, my husband really didn't want me coming here. And so I asked her, well, why doesn't he want you to come here? She's like, well, he's really scared that you're going to try to convert me. So, and she was like, being snarky about it. So it was just like, oh, we convert people on Thursday. It's Tuesday, so you're completely fine. Like you have nothing to worry about. There's no conversion today. And her eyes kind of popped out and was like, oh my God, what's going to happen? And then she calmed down. But by the end of it, her demeanor completely changed because first she opened her heart to come, even with all her biases, but we also opened our door to let her in. And we were able to sit down and have a great civilized conversation. And I heard everything she had to say, all the misconceptions she thought about me as a woman. And I was like, oh my God, I can't believe she thinks all of this, but I listened to her and I addressed all of her issues. And at the end of it, she walked out saying, wow, my perception of Muslims completely changed by this conversation. So talking and understanding and listening are so key in this whole process that we're going through.
Touche. Wow, you get to have the last word, Ms. Fariad. And, we are well out of time. And I want to thank you all. We had never met, most of us, and now we're leaving this conversation as friends, and I'm sure we can continue more of this, and there will be a part 2. Again, my heartfelt thanks to the DC South Asian Arts Council for putting this together. Nacha, you and your team, Manoj, Geeta, everybody who have really made this possible to lift up our voices here so we could come here and have a really candid conversation and an emotional one. And I thank you all for your contributions, and I look forward to staying in touch. And thank you to everyone in Asia who woke up early, including Nacha. I know my parents are watching, and it was 6 a.m. in India, and they didn't sleep all night looking at the clock so that they could be on for this live. And so to all our audience and to the organizers, again, thank you very much, and we'll see you again soon.